James Richardson, a prominent figure in American sociology of religion, who is regarded as one of the most outstanding experts in the field of law and religion in the world, notes that contemporary usage of the term cult has evolved into a term of contempt or humiliation, and is no longer a neutral designation of a religious group. Nowadays, the term cult carries a value-laden set of derogatory stereotypes. The use of this term leads to stigmatization, discrimination, and violence against religious minorities, as well as social and political associations. Moreover, today the words cult and sect are impregnated with negative connotations to such an extent that they become catalysts for terrorist attacks and even genocide. Richardson and a number of other sociologists and researchers of religions, such as Baron van Driel, Stuart Wright, and others, point out that the term cult or sect is disparaging and conveys a stereotype which has serious consequences when applied to groups of people. Labeling a group as a cult or a sect can be an excuse for the government to attack the group and ultimately destroy it.
Despite the fact that reputable world scientists warn that the use of the word cult or sect causes great harm to people and should be avoided, especially in academic literature and court proceedings, representatives of the anti-cult movement continue to actively exploit this label and propagate it through the media, turning magazines and newspapers into mouthpieces of their hateful rhetoric.
When claiming that someone belongs to a cult or a sect, anti-cultists base their accusations not on academic papers or legal investigations, but on their own dubious and abstract concept of brainwashing. This idea has no scientific ground and is extremely vague. Nevertheless, exactly on the basis of the unreliable concept of brainwashing, anti-cultists label targeted groups and organizations as cults or sects. Brainwashing is an unscientific concept where the so-called cults and sects are accused of rigidly controlling the consciousness of their participants, which is why people can allegedly turn into zombies due to manipulation of their beliefs, thoughts, and behavior. Not only is this concept untenable, but it is also extremely dangerous as it leads to dehumanization. When society believes that an individual has been brainwashed, people stop regarding him as a sane individual. Instead of a human with his own thoughts and decisions, others begin to perceive him as a zombie or a puppet. Meanwhile, with such a perception of a person or a group of people, it is much easier to use violence against them. Forensic psychologist Dick Anthony states that the concept of brainwashing and the fear associated with it are used by the anti-cult movement as a tool to justify persecution of religious minorities. The court determined that the concept of brainwashing cannot be applied as a legal charge since it is untenable and unscientific. However, despite this, American anti-cultists continue to actively promote the concept of brainwashing to justify their sadistic practice of forcible deprogramming, meaning forced renunciation of beliefs, which among other things brought them commercial benefits. The destructive concepts of brainwashing and deprogramming have been introduced and are actively promoted by henchmen of the enemy of democracy in America, representatives of the anti-cult movement. The two figures who are especially notable for their cruelty and inhumanity and who spread the enemy's narratives on American territory are anti-cultists and deprogrammers Stephen Hesson and Rick Allen Ross. Currently, they are actively engaged in public activities and speak in American mass media, where they propagate the rhetoric of anti-cult terrorism, violence, and hatred. Deprogramming. Both Ross and Hesson were active members of the anti-cult organization Cult Awareness Network, CAN, which ceased to exist in 1996, as it was convicted of a number of gross violations of human rights and severe religious discrimination. The organization went bankrupt and paid compensation to the people who had suffered from it. being the leading members of this organization in the 1980s and 90s. Both Rick Ross and Steven Hessen were actively involved in its primary criminal activity, arranging and carrying out forcible deprogramming processes. Deprogramming is an illegal anti-human practice rooted in Nazi methods. When practicing deprogramming, anti-cultists would unlawfully abduct and forcibly detain a person whom they considered to be a cult member or a sectarian. In the process of deprogramming, the victim was subjected to psychological and physical torture to force them to change their beliefs. Deprogramming was done on a commercial basis. Anti-cultists charged a fairly high fee from the victim's relatives for their forcible re-education services, during which a person usually underwent torture, torments, beatings, and various forms of violence, including sexual violence. Since this practice severely violated human rights, the founder of this method, Ted Patrick, appeared in court many times and served prison terms. In a number of trials, courts have ruled that deprogramming is illegal. Rick Ross, the American anti-cultist, performed more than 500 forcible deprogramming sessions in his life. In 1991, Ross was charged with unlawful detention and forcible deprogramming of Jason Scott, a member of the United Pentecostal Church International, UPCI, whose mother was referred to Ross by representatives of CAN. Scott later filed a civil suit against Ross, two of his associates in CAN, in federal court. In September 1995, a 9-member jury unanimously held the defendants, Ross and his accomplices, liable for conspiracy to deprive Scott of his civil rights and religious liberties. In addition, the jury held that Ross and his associates, quote, intentionally or recklessly acted in a way so outrageous in character and so extreme in degree as to go beyond all possible bounds of decency and to be regarded as atrocious and utterly intolerable in a civilized community. Ross's criminal activities in this abduction case resulted in the closure of the Cult Awareness Network, which was exposed as a criminal network for kidnappers. The story of Scott, who became a victim of brutal deprogramming arranged by Ross, is striking in its cruelty. He was abducted using physical force. They knocked him down to the ground, dragged him into a van, handcuffed him, taped his mouth, and tied his legs. During the abduction, a 300-pound man sat on Scott's back. Scott's legs, upper body and back, suffered multiple bruises and abrasions when he was being dragged into the van by stairs, on the floor, and through a patio. Scott was detained in a specially equipped prison house under constant supervision. For 5 days, he was subjected to psychological pressure. They insulted his faith and threatened him. Ross regularly hit Scott on the head when they argued about religion. Scott was promised freedom only if he would give up his beliefs. A detailed study of the effective cases of deprogramming carried out by Rick Ross reveals the terrible truth. Many of those cases were accompanied by destruction of families and complete dehumanization of the victims. The people whom he allegedly helped in this way were subjected to coercion, deception, and humiliation. They were deprived of their right to free choice and forced to renounce deeply rooted religious beliefs. These people who were broken and lost faith became living evidence of the cruelty and treachery of Ross's methods. His demonstrative successes in deprogramming were covered with a shadow of ruined destinies and irreparable psychological traumas. Ross used people's fears and weaknesses with cold logic in order to profit from their troubles, demonstrating complete indifference to the suffering he caused. His actions are clearly characterized by violence, cruelty, and cold-bloodedness that turn people's misfortune into a source of his own benefit. The second figure and henchman of anti-cult movement in America is deprogrammer Steven Hessen. American mass media give him a platform to speak as a cult expert, but they do not mention that Steve Hessen's expertise is violent abuse against American citizens and their civil rights.
Hassan was an accomplice in the Cult Awareness Network. This anti-religious hate group served as a national referral service for so-called deprogrammers. They ran a racket to kidnap, assault, and traumatize law-abiding men and women for profit, all to coerce them into recanting their religious beliefs. And Steve Hassan is a notorious deprogrammer. Hassan led the squad that traumatized one adult victim, Arthur Roselle, for 2 weeks to try and break the man's faith. In sworn testimony, Roselle recounted his physical and mental assault. Hassan's team threw him to the floor, cutting and bruising his face. They bound his hands and feet and held him captive for days on end. They deprived him of sleep and violated his privacy and basic dignity. When Roselle refused to recant his religious beliefs, Hassan threatened to inject him with shots. And to add insult to injury, Hassan tried to induce his victim to lie and commit perjury about the crime. Then there was the testimony of Lauren Sala. Hassan's team broke into her motel room, threw her from the bed, and threatened to break her leg if she called for help or tried to escape. They took her hostage and drove her to a remote hideaway, where they imprisoned her for 8 days, trying to break her faith. When Hassan's thugs failed, he tormented Sala for 3 more days, until she managed to negotiate her release. Another of Hassan's victims, Claire Kelly, also testified that Hassan unlawfully held her captive. He had her held in a room with no knobs on the windows, kept her under 24-hour guard, and violated her privacy. Hassan pawned himself off as a, quote, expert on religions in court cases, bilking unsuspecting families for his so-called expert testimony, until courts caught on to his crackpot theories. Hassan would continue his anti-religious assaults, now under the name of intervention.
It is excessively alarming and suspicious that despite documented evidence that both Hassan and Ross are violent individuals prone to sadism, who lack empathy and have an unhealthy desire to harm people and incite hatred in society, they continue to appear on America's mainstream TV channels. Their articles are published in leading periodicals, and mass media are guided by their opinions. A legitimate question arises: who is behind them and ensures their immunity? What is the force that manipulates and supports them?